I've already spoken about how the RPG Maker engine is one that's accessible to most people, whether they can code or not, on the only video on my channel that people watch. The trade-off with an engine like this is that most development is solely in a predefined user interface, so the variation of possible types of games to come out of the engine is pretty limited. In Unity, for instance, more controls given to you, so games with very little similarity like City Skylines, Hearthstone, or Inside have popped out of it. Whereas in RPG Maker, you'll have the occasional platform or hack and slash go against the grain, but the vast majority of games will be top-down 2D JRPG style games. It's this idea that made the insurgence of RPG Maker horror games so intriguing to me. More on this in a future video, but for the time being, a prominent creator in this very indie scene is INNIT. Being the dev behind Paranoiac, Insanity, Mermaid Swamp, and perhaps her most well-known title, The Crooked Man, most of us in the scene will know her for at least one of these games, as they garnered a large viewership in the peak Let's Play days of YouTube. I had known about RPG Maker for ages beforehand, but I got into RPG Maker horror games admittedly after watching PewDiePie's playthroughs of a lot of them. And I think this may have actually been one of the first examples of content viewership driving game reception, like we're seeing on a much larger scale now with Among Us, for instance. But I digress. In this era, games like Ao Oni stood out for their random chase scenes, Mad Father and Misao for their open settings and plot lines. But to me, Udi's work stands out in how deeply personal each title feels. A litty like a titty YouTuber named Super Eyepatch Wolf had a video on horror manga that I enjoyed recently, where he says this.
I think horror is at its best when it's intense and personal, and because manga can be produced by a single person at a relatively low cost, at least compared to games or movies, it means that there's more room for weird, experimental, personal kinds of horror, letting each author carve out their own distinctive brand of fear.
And I couldn't agree more. Horror is extremely niche, because one, what spooks me might not necessarily spook you. You might be scared of ghosts, heights, or deep water, whereas I'm scared of giant titty Ursula SpongeBob crossover porn. And two, not everyone likes getting spooked in the first place. This means putting out horror content that is very personal and experimental is often very risky. With horror already being niche as it is, you can stand to waste a lot of time and money as the production budget increases. As Eyepatch Wolf said, manga being quite an individualized, relatively inexpensive medium alleviates a bit of this pressure, and I think the simplicity of the RPG Maker engine does the very same thing. Without having to worry about building your own physics, 3D models, particle effects, or advanced AI, the RPG Maker engine allows you to skip a lot of this time-consuming work to instead let you be experimental elsewhere. In Udi's case, the focus in her games always seems to be her storytelling, particularly with an emphasis on character development. A common theme she explores time and time again in doing so is the distinction between reality and the supernatural, using horror as an avenue to convey this. This is very much seen in her Strange Man series. Even those that aren't into the pixel horror scene may have seen or heard The Crooked Man, but not many know that it's actually just one quarter of an entire series of similar games. So today, in my biggest clusterfuck of an endeavor yet, I'm going to go through each of these games and go over not just what makes each of them stand out, but what makes them all connect into a cohesive series. Big spoilers ahead. Without further ado, starting off with the big boy, the one that started it all, The Crooked Man. Originally based off an innocent 1842 English nursery rhyme, Udi went, yeah, nah, I'm gonna make it some fucking terrifying zombie cunt whose neck is the opposite direction of everyone else's. And The Crooked Man was born. The Crooked Man follows the story of David Hoover, though he may as well have been called David Smith, or Common Guy, or Man, because this guy really has no distinct traits at all. David is a painfully average 26-year-old blonde hair, blue eyes everyman whose occupation is clerk. With the help of his mate Paul, David's just moved into a new apartment during a pretty difficult stage in his life, considering his mother's in hospital with a severe brain tumor and his girlfriend Shirley's just split up with him. As soon as he does though, strange, spooky things start happening. Like writing on the mirror. Ever since she went away, I've spent every night...
I'll just get back to bed.
Hearing distant crying.
Never mind, sleep time.
A mysterious unknown phone call.
Hello? Hello, who is this?
Hello, can I talk to somebody who can tell me about happily hypothetically happy screensaver?
Oh well, I'm tired, bedtime.
Or even... Is that Doomsday Armageddon and therefore the literal end of the world as we know it? Ah,
I'll just get back to bed.
It takes him bloody long enough, but when he finally cannot take it anymore, he sets off on a long, grueling journey following the tracks of the apartment's previous tenant, in the hope that meeting him may resolve his spooky situation. This means you end up visiting an abandoned hotel, an abandoned school, and then an abandoned hospital. And before long, you realize you're not alone. The Crooked Man is following you. With each new location, David meets someone new, and in the process learns a great deal about himself out of sheer empathy towards their circumstances. In the hotel, we meet Sissy, a timid, insecure young woman who simply cannot get over a previous relationship. In the school, we meet Dee, a brutally stubborn and bad-tempered ginger kid who, despite taking the entrance exam 5 times, still hasn't gotten into law school. And finally, in the hospital, we meet little Fluffy, an energetic, happy-go-lucky child that's been abandoned by his mother. Each of these 3 characters actually represents an aspect of difficulty or trauma in the previous tenant's life that he's left behind. And as David follows his trail meeting them, he quickly realizes just how similar he and the former tenant are. Despite being broken up with long ago, Sissy can't help but cry over her lost love, and David is also very much still heartbroken from losing Shirley. Each of them are still afflicted, with the reasoning behind the decision being that their kindness was all they had. From this interaction, David learns that suppressing this side to him and allowing it to fuel his rampant self-hatred will do nothing to bring Shirley back, much less be beneficial to him at all. Instead, all he can do is strive to self-acceptance in viewing his sensitive, sentimental side not as cowardice, but as something uniquely positive. Similarly, David relates with the stubbornness Dee has towards achieving his goal of getting into law school. Despite lacking the intelligence needed to succeed in law, Dee relentlessly tries and tries again to reach this childhood dream, having failed the entrance exam 5 times over. Again, very similar to David as it turns out, as it's revealed that despite the realization that his colorblindness would prevent him from becoming a pilot, David faked his way into flight school anyway, before being exposed moments before graduating, having his lifelong dream crushed.
Reckon he should have went with becoming a YouTuber instead.
David realizes from meeting Dee that in life sometimes shit just happens that we have no control over, and oftentimes the refusal to accept these things in blind pursuit of our dreams just puts us in a never-ending cycle of self-loathing, trying to delay the inevitable, doomed to eventually fail. There's nothing wrong with having a dream and pursuing it, but we can't let it narrow our scope on life. It's simply not possible for every single one of us to become pilots, lawyers, doctors, engineers, astronauts, or PewDiePie. For the vast majority of us, a big hurdle to overcome is accepting this fact and instead opting to enjoy our life for what it is. Whether we make dumb YouTube videos for a living or we serve dumb customers sparkling mineral water at an Indian restaurant. With both of these interactions, the game gives the player 2 choices. One that leads to a good ending and one that leads to a bad one. In both cases, the choices that let you progress are those that represent the acceptance of the harsh realities to life over stubborn refusal. And structuring these moral lessons as consequences to decisions the player makes was a nice touch to help really solidify their impact. Finally, having been abandoned by his mother, Fluffy represents the same issues of abandonment the former tenant, and coincidentally David, struggle with. Following these 3 interactions, David begins to realize that his life has always been crooked. Whether it be his relationship, his career, or his family, nothing's worked out for him. It's alongside this that David also realizes the Crooked Man as the vengeful spirit of the previous tenant he's been pursuing. Beneath the surface though, to me the Crooked Man serves as a powerful metaphor. He represents the dark, defeatist side to ourselves that could come up in any period of adversity throughout our lives. In times of difficulty where shit happens to us that we just feel so helpless dealing with, it's easy to fall into a cyclic state of negativity and self-pity. In this state, we're so much more vulnerable to hardship. One moment we lose a loved one, the next our job, and before we know it, we're viewing our entire lives as crooked. Yet, in this tale, David Hoover, the most average run-of-the-mill man, exhibits so much resilience and strength at such a low point in his life that it's hard not to feel inspired watching him. A quote of his that really stood out to me was, "It's not much, but I make my own money. I got a girlfriend, I drink with my buddy on the weekends, and I enjoy my life for what it is." In such a short time, The Crooked Man is a game that teaches an important lesson. Happiness doesn't just come from succeeding and achieving our goals or maintaining relationship with others. Sure, all of that helps a lot, but true fulfillment with life comes not from relying on these external factors, but instead from our own internal outlook. The idea that should all of these things go wrong, we could still make it through. Maybe that's it. Or, wait, what's the opposite of crooked? Get the fuck out of my room, you little shit. I don't have any mayonnaise left in my house anymore because of you. Ah, see, you're close, but not quite. See, the opposite of crooked is straight. Please acknowledge how depressing you've made my lunchtime sandwiches. Therefore, we can also deduce that crooked means gay. What? It's basic inverse properties, man. If straight is the reciprocal of crooked, we can therefore deduce that the reciprocal of straight is equivalent to crooked. Considering the reciprocal of gay is straight, the crooked man could also be interpreted as the gay man. That is the real meaning of this game. You know, I can't quite work out if you're the smartest human being I've ever met or the absolute dumbest. Probably the latter. Clearly you haven't gotten into the same bed as D and unlocked the boy love achievement. I stand corrected. With quite a tough act to follow, the second installment in the series that came 2 years later was The Sandman. I didn't know at the time, but turns out the Sandman's also an existing fictional character, just like the Crooked Man is. Apparently he sprinkles magical sand onto kitties' eyes to get them to fall asleep and have wonderful magical dreams of love and happiness. But I don't know about you, Sam, but on a list of strategies to ensure a peaceful night's rest, I don't think sprinkling sand is particularly high up there. That's according to Scandinavian folklore though, and with the Scandinavian people I know, doesn't surprise me. Can you lads just fuck off and stop barging into my room? Like, come on man, think about it. What if I'm like with a girl or something? You play as Sophie Grundler, a red-haired 17-year-old high school student who suffers from insomnia. Gradually, we realize Sophie's only friendship with a girl called Anne leaves her unsatisfied. She's bullied at school, and her relationship with her widower father has deteriorated as of late. So she leaves her bed one night, and everyone outside is fast asleep, except one person. A familiar face. That's right, it's Man. The Sandman kind of surprised me in how different it is to its predecessor. Initially, it seemed quite similar to the Crooked Man. A focus on the main character and a problem they're facing, solving puzzles, and in particular, the dark, eerie setting. And this was reinforced when Sophie finds her friend Anne being chased by a group of shadows. Except, surprisingly, the game kind of just 180s and starts to introduce fantasy elements. Hundreds of bizarre soldiers are prosecuting a school bully in a shopping mall. A random blue dragon comes after her and her dad in his office building. Also, turns out man isn't actually a man. He's a lullaby. Duh, you fucking idiot. Before you know it, you're in fairyland. And this isn't me exaggerating, you're actually in fairyland. You meet a swamp mermaid with titties and skin problems. You meet a blind dwarf who's more chill than Snoop Dogg 18 dabs in. You meet the tooth fairy, who has shit teeth. You meet a psycho river unicorn. And finally, you meet the Sandman, and he makes this noise. The rest of the game involves solving different puzzles to explore more of this world and the Sandman's strange house, and hopefully saving the world from eternal slumber. Unsurprisingly, I didn't have quite the substantial takeaway from the Sandman that the Crooked Man gave me, but seeing Sophie develop throughout the game was nice. The staple Uri character development was definitely still there. A highlight for me was Sophie's realization that all these seemingly horrible things that happened to her in the sleeping nightmare world were actually things she subconsciously wanted to happen. Despite acting unaffected, she desperately wanted her bully to suffer for how she's treated her. Despite pretending to understand how much more her father needed to work after her mother's death, she desperately wanted his attention and care. Despite her telling Anne that it was okay for her not to defend her against her bullies, she couldn't help but feel betrayed by Anne's inactions. I didn't see this coming at all, and it served as a surprising portrayal of the damage that acting in contradiction to our true feelings to appease others will often have on our well-being. A less typical approach to the always being true to yourself cliche, perhaps. The main aspect that separates the Sandman from all the other titles in the series is straight up its genre. To me, the first quarter of the game, set in the human world, felt like it followed the same recipe that the Crooked Man did, before the whole premise of the game dramatically transforms into a fantasy adventure where we arrive in fairyland. This felt pretty abrupt, and to be honest, aside from the highlight of Sophie's epiphany that I mentioned, the first part was pretty slow and actually a lot less enjoyable than the fantasy part, particularly the fact that the main setting was an entire town where about 4 out of the 20 doors were actually openable. Regardless, playing this after The Crooked Man, knowing it's part of the same series, will come as a bit of a surprise. In some extra notes about the game's development, Udi mentioned she was fully aware of this, and honestly I admire how open to experiment that she was, irrespective of how well The Crooked Man did. It's interesting to see how different two very similar games can be. I think that as a creator you can probably feel quite obligated to appeal to your audience by giving them more of what's received well.
Or not so received well, as it turns out.
But also that regardless, the biggest priority with whatever you're making should always be that it's something you're passionate about. Regardless, if you're into these types of indie RPG Maker horror games but want a premise that stands out from the rest and not too big on horror, then definitely check this one out. Udi continued to experiment with the third title of the series, The Boogie Man. As with the other two, the Boogie Man is also obviously a pre-existing fictional character, and definitely the most well-known one in the series. And for a change, one that actually has typically spooky origins. Right off the bat, the Boogie Man definitely gave the impression that it was looping back to the horror focus seen in The Crooked Man that took a back seat in the Sandman. The player is Keith Bering, a cold, cryptic 37-year-old investigator who, yes, is most definitely a little bit cliche, yet, regardless, to me was still the most interesting protagonist. I ended up pretty fond of Keith. While his strife wasn't perhaps as relatable as David's was, I found that his character was the one I was most invested in, and the one I feel exhibits the most growth as a person.
Assuming you get the good ending.
Set in Livingstone, a huge castle that was once owned by a wealthy tyrant in charge of a multitude of slaves, Keith and his wife Helena are on a vacation with a tourist group of familiar faces. With a brief intro segment before shit hits the fan, we learn that Keith and his wife's relationship is a bit on the ropes, as she reveals her favorite carbonated beverage is Coke, and he subsequently realizes she's a living human incarnation of Satan Lucifer. As well as this, David and Shirley are married now, and Sophie went from the strong, resolved woman we saw at the end of the Sandman to being a weird, squeaky 12-year-old anime girl in this game.
What is he, a robot? What are you saying, Papa? But I didn't talk to you much, Papa.
Oh, come on. It seems Udi was aware of this too. In some dev notes, she said that Sophie's newfound openness and restored relationship with her father meant she was more comfortable being childish now than she was. So, I mean, I get it, but come on. Sophie is allegedly 18 years old in this game, yet she and her dad treat each other like this.
Come on, let's talk.
That's my selfish little girl.
Needless to say, the average 18-year-old where I'm from is a little different.
Oi, you cats got any weed or not? We chuck us a dart can. Yeah, what?
So you go outside this fateful night and all of a sudden everyone's been kidnapped by, you guessed it, the Boogie Man.
So sorry to disturb your slumber, detective.
And he taunts you to play along with his game. From here on out, it's Keith's job to try to catch him, disarm his traps, uncover the mystery of the castle, cure cancer, collect the 7 Dragon Balls, redirect an incoming meteor, unlock the 8th gate, and also save everyone's lives in the process. All before Christmas morning. The Boogie Man tackles slightly darker issues than its predecessors. It's revealed that Keith and Helena lost their only son years ago. And while Helena was able to gradually mourn and move on from it, Keith never got the chance. To be someone Helena can rely on, Keith never cries, never loses his cool, never shows any weakness. With this immeasurable guilt of not being able to protect his only son hanging over him, he resorts to putting all of his attention on his work as an investigator to protect innocent people. And this is conveyed very well in the plot as the gameplay revolves around attempting to protect as many of the other guests as you can. This reveal kind of comes as a shock as well. You play through the first third of the game or so just thinking Keith's kind of an asshole, but end it feeling so sorry for him with all he's been through. Eventually it's revealed that Helena's reason for wanting to divorce Keith at the beginning was simply so she wouldn't be a burden on him anymore, which was Keith's very reason for being so narrowly focused on his work, to always be a shoulder for Helena to cry on, to stay occupied, and to avoid breaking down. It struck me as an extreme example of a fairly common circumstance, and not necessarily just a romantic one. When we act solely on our own judgment to avoid burdening the people close to us, it will often do more harm than good, as it inherently creates more distance between you. In some cases, someone might want nothing more than for you to just be able to rely on them. A critical aspect of closer relationships, whether it be with friends, family, or a significant other, is allowing yourself to be vulnerable to each other.
To be honest, I'm a bit rubbish at this, which
Definitely helped make this game impactful to me. The puzzle-solving gameplay is not dissimilar from the previous games, except that navigating the castle is a bit of a pain in the ass, especially walking up and down stairs.
holy shit! shit!
And there also felt like there were far more potential ways to fuck up when playing. But what interested me the most when playing the Boogie Man was that it swaps the dynamic the prior two games had. You aren't being chased anymore, but are in fact the one chasing after the Boogie Man. Being a police investigator as opposed to a clerk or a high school student, you actually feel more capable of fighting back than the last games. Regardless, the Boogie Man is still a threatening antagonist, and very quickly is this established. Where the Crooked Man and the Sandman delve into the supernatural, the Boogie Man surprises you by taking a more realistic approach in quite a clever way. At first, the game steadily characterizes the Boogie Man as this terrifying, unstoppable monster, which you don't really think to question considering how each of the last two games had the same type of antagonist. But in the end,
Assume you get the good ending.
he ends up just being some sick, twisted fanatic toying with people's lives. He seemed to always show up where you least expect, when really he just set up a ton of shortcuts to get around the castle quickly. He seemed to know everything about the characters, knowing just what to say to get them to lose their cool, when really he'd just done a lot of background checks on their history before they'd arrived. But how else does Udi still manage to separate this from the other two games? Where did all that experimentation go for the Boogie Man? Well, I'm glad you asked, loyal viewer that somehow got this far through the video. Udi's experimental side comes out in this third title with the inclusion of voice acting. That's right, folks, as is very uncommon for an indie pixel horror game, all the dialogue in this game is voice acted. And from the limited amount of reception I've seen on this game, this seems to be the biggest talking point, and a divisive one at that. Decent game, but voice acting, oh god, no, the difference in mics is obvious, and they sound as emotionless as my daily life. I love the game and this style, but it's just that voice acting, I think it would be better without it. Earlier, I wrote a review on this game claiming the voiceovers ruined it for me. Well, after a while you get used to them voices and you start remembering the joys and great aspects of this series and its games. Not bad. This horrible game. Pretty hard to got the other endling, and the achievements than bad endling 3. Hard to find solutions until last moment of the good or bad endling. Similar, like life or death. Maybe a bit easy for you, if you read well on English. English language is not my main language. So, what are my thoughts? Well, it's kind of bad, but it's interesting. That's the short version, but there's a lot to unpack here. There are 3 main issues I'd like to go over. First is how dialogue works in this type of game, where the majority of the chat boxes are skippable. Naturally, people usually read them at their own pace, so it makes the actual pacing of the voice acting inconsistent and difficult to control.
Please let me go.
Not yet. He's the kind of guy who puts out corpses for show.
So, you finally arrived here to save Prince? I've been waiting for... Stop skipping my dial. Seriously, stop. Motherfucker!
Which is a pretty important aspect to just throw out the window. Second, this is not a particularly well-known title, and it's a free game. Naturally, those auditioning for the voice roles would likely have all been fans, driven purely by their love for the series. I highly doubt they were paid roles, so unsurprisingly, this meant that 1. Some of the voice actors sounded straight up more skilled than others, and 2. The actual ambient noise and audio quality of each of the speakers' microphones tended to vary, which doesn't really help in terms of immersion. Helena's voice was so damn breathy and oftentimes slower than it needed to be.
Sorry for going back without you. I wanted to take a shower. Who will keep you from getting wet?
Sophie's a 12-y now, and her voice made this even more apparent.
Why don't you want it?
The Boogeyman's voice seemed a bit tame. From the way he acted and the stuff he said, to me it would have made more sense for him to sound more crazy and over the top, more akin to the Joker, for instance.
How do you do, detective? I am the Boogeyman.
David's voice was fine, Lance's was a bit better, Shirley sounded the best to me, despite her not really having a great deal of dialogue. Keith I'm pretty torn on. My third issue with the voice acting was the occasional incompatibility between what's written and what's spoken. You wouldn't otherwise really notice, but some of the dialogue in games like this doesn't always come across as organic speech.
And I realized I was a burden on him that would keep him from ever walking again.
My wife always brings me warm milk before I go to bed.
And most of this is completely justified. Considering Udi's Japanese and the voice acting was in English,
Thanks to the literal saint VG person, big props to you for translating and letting us English plebs play so many awesome games.
it's understandable that when choosing from the auditioning candidates, her criteria would be more focused purely on the sound of their voice, as it would be difficult to assess the technical ability and intonation of the candidate not being a native speaker. With this in mind, I actually liked the voice of Keith, and I do think it suited the character, particularly in the early stages of the game, but at times it did feel like he lacked any emotion or oomph in his voice. Sometimes Keith was a complete badass, and others he was just a bit of a wally. But regardless, I loved him anyway. With all this in mind, do I think the inclusion of voice acting was a mistake? Absolutely not. It provided not only an avenue for Uri to keep experimenting with her work, but also an opportunity for fans and budding voice actors to collaborate in a charming indie project. It felt a little odd at first, but after getting used to it, I came to like having the voices there. It gives a bit of added depth to the characters, for better or for worse, and regardless, at any point in the game, you can toggle on or off the majority of the voice acting, so it just really isn't something to complain about. All in all, ironically, the Boogie Man was probably my favorite in the series, despite me having the most criticism to say about it. Even with its problems, I enjoyed this game the most. Using a walkthrough probably made a monumental difference with this, but more on that later.
Don't blame it on the sunshine. Don't blame it on the moonlight.
Don't blame it on the good times. Blame it on the questionable voice acting, difficult puzzles, confusing math, forgettable save system, lack of direction and stairs.
Finally, in the last game of the series, the Hanged Man, for once the title isn't the same as the antagonist. Instead, the Hanged Man is more of a metaphorical side character in the subplot of the game. In the Hanged Man, you play as some kid. With no context given, you're alone in the snow at night, and naturally, you decide the best thing to do in this situation is to go to a fishing shop. But alas, your fishing level is just not as good as your agility, so you fucking destroy one of the rods.
Hey, what do you think you're doing?
The owner rightfully gets pissed off, and all of a sudden, Superman David comes along to save you, saying you're apparently his cousin and that he'll reimburse him. Anyway, you run away again, then hey, that's Sophiana Hill, so meanwhile you have some rat named Pop in your pocket that talks to you and is your only friend. All of a sudden you're in a mental hospital because that seems like a great idea. I mean, you are talking to a fucking rat. Oh hey, that's Keith. Okay, no, so it turns out you do talk and your name's Will. You look kind of familiar? Maybe? Nah, probably not. So your dickhead rats run off and you gotta try find him. Meanwhile, you meet some homeless guy called Ed. He seems nice.
He's not nice.
Throughout your time at the hospital, you run into Keith on multiple occasions as he furthers his investigation, and you get an insight yourself on just what happened here so many years ago. Occasionally running into Ed too.
Yeah, no, on second thought, it actually does seem nice.
So you remember how in The Crooked Man, David and his mum were all alone and she died in a hospital? Well, it turns out while that was happening, David's dad buggered off and shagged some other bird, and guess who popped out? That's right, Keith. Will's actually David's half-brother. Over the course of the game, we're given plenty of flashbacks of Will's childhood, realizing he's always spoken to animals and toys and seen a lot of weird spirit things, the Hanged Man being one of them. All that shit weirded out the other kids, so he's kind of had a pretty lonely childhood, always living predominantly in his own imagination. For me, this game was primarily a coming-of-age story. It tells the tale of a lost child with no direction in life. On a fundamental level, children rely entirely on their parents or guardians purely just to survive, but kids rely on adults for so much more under the hood. When growing up, we learn so much from the people around us about how to process our emotions, express ourselves, and make our own decisions. Will struggled in these formative years, with a family history that left him feeling as if he was a demon child. Sure, we as rational adults can see this as over the top, but as a kid, even the tiniest, silliest things you might think or hear can stick with you, especially with little guidance towards dealing with it. I remember in year 2 or something, I was a wee boy, and some little squirt in my ear told me I looked like SpongeBob because my head was so big. I mean, hey, he wasn't wrong, but it was the first time anyone had made a comment like that about the size of my head of all things. I didn't even process it as abnormal or different to anyone else until then. But hey, surprise, surprise, from then on I'd always be insecure about it and grew a rank bowl cut to try cover it up. Little did I know it was mostly just my shite hairline that gave off the SpongeBob look, but hey, now that I'm somehow an adult, I can now recognize and laugh at it. I learned that, aside from Harry Styles, everyone's got something wrong with them. It's just bloody well part of life, so it's not a big deal anymore. Will feels like he's different to everyone else, and based off past experiences, hyper paranoid about revealing that to others. Juggling this with his difficult family situation, he's in an inner deadlock of sorts, not really knowing what to do about it, and just desperately wants some form of guidance. Gradually, he manages to process his history and his circumstances, being influenced by none other than Keith. Being fond of Keith already, recalling how he'd lost his only son, it was nice to see him take on just a little bit of a father role for Will. I think Uri struck a good balance, where the majority of Will's improvement was self-driven, yet the occasional guidance from an authority figure like Keith went a long way. I also like how the ending didn't go the cliche route, by making it out like in the end nothing was really wrong with Will from the get-go. The whole, nothing's wrong with being different, be true to who you are, love yourself even if your only friend is a talking rat called Pop meme is pretty overused and often feels like it's missing the point to me. Sure, none of these things are wrong, except maybe the rat bit, but Will was clearly shown to be struggling, and shown to be discontent with the way his life was. And sure, in the end scene where he no longer hears Pop talking to him anymore, it's definitely a sad moment of realization to witness. But it was a bittersweet feeling. I saw this as a pivotal point of improvement for him towards a brighter future. A big drawing point to this game was experiencing more of what's already worked well so far in the series. We get to learn more about the whole band of characters we've come to mostly know and love, all while getting a fresh new setting to explore with puzzles to solve and spooks to spook. Will was a bit of a wuss at times, but he's a kid, that's part of the gig. Voice acting didn't really change a whole lot from the Boogie Man, nor did the gameplay from the rest of the series. If you've gotten this far in the series, you may as well play this one just for that reason alone, but regardless, it holds up as worth playing. The gameplay in this series was often very linear, where you'd need one item to reach one room, and this cycle would just repeat. I think widening the potential different orders you can approach to exploring and puzzle solving would add a lot to the experience of playing. Also, the gameplay often lacked direction, where you'd simply have to blindly check a multitude of rooms until you find the one that lets you progress, which was particularly frustrating in maps that are artificially broadened with tons of doors or buildings that you can just never end up opening. As well as this, the in-menu save system to me is less preferable to a save point approach, as it places the expectation on players to save before unforeseen events happening, potentially risking losing a bunch of progress. As a result, if you're interested in playing these games, I recommend saving frequently and not being afraid to resort to a walkthrough should you get lost or confused. If not, I'd also highly recommend watching a Let's Play series on any of them instead, as I feel that their format suits these videos quite well. On top of these gameplay issues, I'd love to see more of a focus being placed on sound design, particularly music, in Udi's future work. I felt that in all the titles in this series, the music always took a back seat. It was often very quiet, and none of the tracks really stood out to me as memorable. I feel that a stronger soundtrack would also help alleviate some of the pressure for the voice acting to always be at its best, as it would no longer be the only sound players are hearing. This is easier said than done, but I feel that even a little bit of extra effort into composing something crude would go a long way, like in Lisa, for instance. What makes Udi's work so special though, especially amongst other similar games in the genre, is her ability to let players connect and relate with her characters. A common theme in most of her work is the balance between reality and the supernatural. In The Crooked Man, it's never confirmed as to whether the Crooked Man was real or not. The Sandman saves Sophie from a life-threatening situation in The Boogie Man. Keith is revealed to attend therapy after discovering that not all the writings and images of the Boogie Man that he saw in the castle were still there when the police searched the scene. Will spoke to a real man hanging himself, as well as his pet rat before this changes at the end of The Hangman. The question as to where the line stands between surreal horror and hallucinatory mental health is never fully answered. In the process, she also manages to take players off guard by weaving impactful moral lessons amongst her minimalistic exploration and puzzle-solving gameplay. Being a creator of sorts, something I like about the Strange Man series is that each title is obviously quite similar, yet also very different from the last. I admire that Udi's open to experimentation in her craft, and would love to see this continue. I think the beauty with a series like this is that people that share the same interest in these types of games can also differentiate from one another in how they respond more or less to varied characters or events in each. After all, aren't we all just strange men? No? Look, I didn't know how to end the video. Just subscribe.